Welcome to the training today, focusing on violations and enforcement of your floodplain management ordinance. My name is Stephanie Frechette. I'm new to OPD as an NFIP coordinator. I'll be presenting today along with my coworker, Sarah Thunberg. Next slide, please. Here's a look at our agenda for today. So in today's presentation, we will provide an overview of the NFIP program and go through FEMA expectations, go through some common violations and minimum requirements, discuss best practices and tools for compliance. Then we'll take a short break before continuing with enforcement of floodplain regulations, and finally have a Q&A before closing the session. Next slide, please. Now for a question, and if you could just enter your response into the chat, how familiar are you with the National Flood Insurance Program? So maybe you've had a lot of experience with this program, some experience, you've heard of it, but you're not too familiar, or you have no experience and you're just now hearing about it. So I'll give you a second to enter your response. All right, some people have lots of experience. Some people have a little experience, so it's nice we have some mixed responses here. Well, welcome everybody, and hopefully you'll learn more through today's presentation. Next slide, please. All right, next question. What is your role in your community? Are you a building code official or a building inspector, community planner, land use staff, local board member, another town official not listed here, or maybe you're not affiliated with a specific community. So again, just enter your responses in the chat, please. So it looks like we have some community planners, some people not affiliated with a community, maybe some building inspectors. All right. So we have a good mix in our audience today. That's great. So next we'll discuss the National Flood Insurance Program, including roles and responsibilities at the local level. So what is expected of your community regarding participation in the National Flood Insurance Program. Next slide, please. What is this program? The National Flood Insurance Program was created by Congress in 1968. It's a voluntary partnership between FEMA and participating communities, where the main goals and objectives of this program is to reduce loss of life and property, reduce disaster relief costs, increase the importance of hazard mitigation, restore and protect floodplains, and make federally backed mortgage coverage available. The NFIP program is often referred to as a three-legged stool, as there's three main components of this program, which include knowing your risks by looking at flood mapping, reducing your risks by adopting floodplain management regulations, and insuring your risks with flood insurance. Approximately 94% of New Hampshire communities are actively participating in this program. While it is a FEMA program, it's implemented at the state level by our office, which is the New Hampshire Department of Business and Economic Affairs, Office of Planning and Development within our state floodplain management program. Next slide, please. The way it works is for a community to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, they agree to adopt and enforce local floodplain regulations that meet the minimum NFIP program requirements that are set forth by FEMA. Flood insurance is then made available for purchase for all property owners and residents, including renters in that participating community. Next slide, please. Let's discuss the community's role in the program and the responsibilities that are expected of a NFIP participating community. First, it's the community's responsibility to understand your local floodplain regulations and understand the FEMA flood maps. So, in order to join the program, all participating communities um, adopt floodplain regulations that meet the minimum requirements as set forth in Chapter 44 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 60.3. It is highly encouraged that communities become familiar with these regulations as they are voted upon and approved by citizens in your community, and they are your floodplain regulations. They might be included in your zoning ordinance or a standalone ordinance, but they're your community's regulations, just like any other regulations are. Next, it's important to understand FEMA's flood maps to know where your floodplain regulations apply. Most communities in New Hampshire follow the minimum requirement that the floodplain regulations apply to all areas designated as special floodplain hazard areas or flood zones by FEMA's flood insurance rate maps. So knowing where those floodplains are in your community is critical as it's where your regulations apply. Next, it's the community's responsibility to ensure that all local permits are applied for all development in the special floodplain hazard area. That includes the requirement that a local issued by the community permit must be issued for all development in those special flood hazard areas. This does include building and non-building development as well. We're going to be talking about how non-building development is defined in just a few slides. Additionally, for existing buildings in the special flood hazard area, ensure that a substantial improvement and substantial damage determination is being made for all existing structures when work is being performed or a permit is being applied for. Next slide, please. Next, it's the community's responsibility to ensure that floodplain development is built according to the approved local permits and your floodplain regulations. Sometimes plans change during construction, whether that is intentional or not, but it still needs to meet your floodplain regulations at the end of the day. An example is that a new structure is being built and the lowest floor is constructed an inch too short of the base flood elevation, or an existing structure is being improved that did not meet the substantial improvement threshold. But as renovations are underway, the property owner decides to do additional work that would then bring the structure to meet the substantial improvement threshold. Finally, while it's up to the community to ensure those regulations are met, the community is responsible to gather and maintain um, records such as built elevation data for new or substantially improved structures in the special flood hazard area. Next slide, please. Finally, the last local responsibility is that the community must take enforcement actions to correct any violations if they were to occur. Again, floodplain regulations are administered and enforced at the local level, so it's your community who's responsible for enforcing those regulations. Failure to enforce or correct any violation may jeopardize a community's good standing in the National Flood Insurance Program. Next slide, please. So now let's discuss some common violations. Most common violations can be grouped into two categories. One is unpermitted development in the floodplain, and the other is when development within the floodplain does not comply with the permit issued by the community. So let's get into it. The first type of common violations is unpermitted development in the floodplain. Any development in the special flood hazard area shall require a permit. Development, as defined in the National Flood Insurance Program, is any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate, including but not limited to buildings or other structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavating, or drilling operation, or storage of equipment or materials. So, in summary, if any building and non-building development is happening in the special flood hazard area, then a permit must be issued. Next slide, please. Here are some common examples of unpermitted development in the floodplain. A common one is structures that are either being constructed or were constructed without a permit. That also means that they may not meet the building requirements included in your floodplain regulations. Another example is improvements to structures without a substantial improvement determination. Every existing structure in the floodplain must have a determination made for any improvements that are performed. There are a few exceptions to that rule, but overall, that determination is always needed. Similarly, repairs to structures without a substantial damage determination. Remember that that needs to be made for all damage caused by any origin, not just flooding. So a fire, a tree falls on the house, a truck runs off the road into the building, that determination needs to be made. Placement of fill. This is a common example of non-building development in the floodplain. Although it's not a structure, it needs to be permitted and meet any watercourse requirements in your floodplain regulations. And same with excavating of earth or materials and storage of equipment or materials. This non-building development requires a permit and must meet the watercourse requirements in your floodplain regulations. The second category of common violations is that development in the floodplain does not follow the permit that was issued by the community. We're going to spend some time talking about this type of violation in the following slides. Next slide, please. A common violation is the lowest floor for A zones or lowest horizontal member for V zones is below the base flood elevation for any freeboard a community may have. So as adopted in your community's regulations, for A zones, which includes flood zones A, AE, and AO, the top of the lowest floor should be at or above the base flood elevation or the design flood elevation if your community has adopted higher standards. For zone V, which are in coastal areas, the bottom of the lowest horizontal structure member must be at or above the base flood elevation or the design flood elevation. Now, this is an approximate. The as-built elevation data provided post-construction by the property owner should ensure these are at the base flood elevation or higher. Also to note, for communities that have adopted or enforced the state building code, while not NFIP minimum requirements, please be aware that the code required at least 1 foot freeboard above the base flood elevation or the design flood elevation be required for residential structures. Another common violation is that a structure has a basement. So a basement is defined by the National Flood Insurance Program as any structure with an enclosed below grade on all four sides. Now, on any new construction or substantial improvement, this is not permitted in the special flood hazard area. This is to avoid a bathtub effect where water would flow in and not be able to flow out, and it would affect the pressure and forces created by that water on the structural integrity of the structure. Just to clarify, this is for new construction or substantial improvement of structures in the floodplain. If a structure is in the floodplain and has a basement, depending on when it was built or what work has been done to it, a basement doesn't automatically equal a violation. It would just be for any structure built after the community joined the program and any substantial improvements determined on that structure regardless of age. Next slide, please. Another violation is that an enclosure, which is permitted assuming it meets the requirements, accidentally becomes a basement. So an enclosure is defined in the National Flood Insurance Program as enclosed walls in areas below the lowest floor of an elevated building. Enclosures below the base flood elevation may only be used for building access, vehicle parking, and storage. They also must have the required flood opening and not be below grade on all sides. For example, in the pictures, you can see two different types of raised houses, both with flood openings and not used as a living space. In other words, storage, building access, and parking. If any of these criteria are not met, then what is considered the lowest floor changes, and they may not meet the lowest floor requirements as we discussed previously. Lowest floor means the lowest floor of the lowest enclosed area, including basement. An unfinished or flood-resistant enclosure usable solely for parking of vehicles, building access, or storage in an area other than a basement area is not considered a building's lowest floor provided that such an enclosure is built in compliance with the applicable non-elevation design requirements in this ordinance. For V zones, which are coastal, enclosures have a slightly different requirement. That space must be free of obstructions or constructed with breakaway walls, open lattice work, and again, be used for parking, building access, or storage. Next slide, please. Another common violation is that an enclosure is missing flood openings. So again, if a structure is elevated to the base flood elevation or above in A zones, enclosures are allowed to be below that lowest floor with proper flood openings installed. FEMA does have some good resources um, on flood openings in foundation walls and wall enclosures. And we have on our webpage more information with these technical bulletins that you can reference. Next slide, please. The next common violation is that the substantial improvement and or substantial damage determination is not met. So a substantial improvement determination needs to be made for every existing structure in your floodplain that is having any work done to it. There's no grandfathering when it comes to structures and requirements in the floodplain related to the National Flood Insurance Program. There are a few exceptions for work done related to life and safety code violations and historic structures, but those are pretty limited. For example, a historic structure needs to meet the definition in your regulations, and typically that means on a state or federal registry of historic places. So it can't just be any old structure, and we do have a lot of those in New Hampshire. So if a structure is determined to be substantially improved or substantially damaged, it must be brought into compliance as if it were new. So you should be aware of any intentional or unintentional changes to the proposed scope of work, as that could change the determination. The substantial improvement and substantial damage desk reference is a good resource to learn more about these requirements. The final common violation that we're going to look at is recreational vehicles are not meeting the requirements of your floodplain management regulations, or they're no longer meeting these requirements. The rule for recreational vehicles is that they must be on site fewer than 180 consecutive days. Yes, that means it can be driven off one day and back the next. It must be fully licensed and ready for highway use. These regulations are intended to ensure that if flooding were to occur, the vehicles could be moved quickly out of the area. This also means that there can be no permanently attached structures to the RV either, like a deck, for instance. So if these requirements or criteria are not met, then the RV must comply with the requirements for a manufactured home. Next slide, please. So now I'll hand it over to Sarah to discuss best practices and tools for compliance.
All right. I am going to be taking over for the next portion of the presentation today. Looks like we actually might end a little early and give you some of your day back. So we're going to talk about best practices and compliance or best practices and what tools are available to bring structures into compliance. So commonly in the NFIP industry, we refer to ways to bring structures into compliance as FRED. FRED is floodproofing, relocation, elevation, and demolition. Those are pretty much all your options for bringing structures into compliance. So one of these four techniques is called floodproofing. There are a couple options for floodproofing depending on whether you're looking at a residential or a non-residential structure. Dry floodproofing is primarily used for non-residential structures in A zones, while wet floodproofing is typically used for residential structures, enclosures, garages, and accessory structures. Dry floodproofing is not permitted in Zone B. However, there are some technical bulletins through FEMA that kind of go over the best practices for dry and wet floodproofing. All right, so dry floodproofing means a combination of measures that make a building and attendant utilities and equipment watertight and substantially impermeable to floodwater, with the structural components having the capacity to resist flood loads. And then wet floodproofing is means the use of techniques that allow floodwater to enter and exit automatically to minimize unequal pressure on the walls. However, the structure will get wet, the flood waters will come in, but the wet floodproofing offers an option for that free flow of water. Typically, these are used through the use of flood vents. And then again, dry floodproofing is not an option for your coastal V zones. All right, so non-residential structures are permitted to be dry floodproofed through your local regulations. And if so, floodproofing designs must be certified by a registered design professional, typically a registered engineer or similar. Any community should utilize the floodproofing certificate for non-residential structures for this purpose. And FEMA has a floodproofing certificate for non-residential structures. If you're not sure where to find that, I believe we also have it on our website, but you can reach out to me and I can direct you to that certificate. All right, so some examples of dry floodproofing methods include temporary installation of waterproof membranes to prevent water from entering a structure. So that would be if you have a mall, for instance, and you are able to put slats in the doors to prevent any flow of water through the doors. That would be one example of a dry floodproofing. Then there's use of sealants and applied to walls, joints, and other openings. Then also you can have openings in walls that are temporarily or permanently sealed shut, or addressing interior drainage to collect leaking water. Now, wet floodproofing can be used on enclosures below elevated buildings, again, with the use of flood vents, as we previously discussed. Wet floodproofing can be used on attached garages, agricultural structures, and accessory structures, and historic structures, and for functionally dependent uses when it is authorized through a variance. And again, so the functionally dependent use is a use which cannot perform its intended purposes unless it is located or carried out in close proximity to waters. This can include, or this term includes only docking facilities, port facilities that are necessary for the loading and unloading of cargo or passengers, and shipbuilding and ship repair facilities, but it does not include long-term storage or related manufacturing facilities. So here are some resources available. There are lots of technical bulletins and uh, resources through FEMA. Um, Technical Bulletin 1 covers requirements for dry flood proofing for non-residential and mixed-use buildings. There is the wet flood proofing requirements, flood proofing for non-residential buildings, and also requirements for agricultural and accessory structures. All of these should be available on our website and through the FEMA library, but if you are having difficulties finding them, please feel free to reach out to us and we can provide you or direct you to these documents. All right, so let's talk about the next letter in Fred. So that is relocation. So depending on the situation, relocation may be an option as it provides the greatest security when flood hazard is severe. It can also reduce flood insurance premiums, though this method may be very costly. Relocation can be appropriate in areas where the flood hazard is severe, such as deep water, rapid rates of rise and fall, short warming times, or short warning times, wave action, high velocity flow, high debris potential, long duration flood events, and erosion. Relocation can involve lifting the structure, putting onto a flatbed truck and hauling to a new site, and then lowering onto a new foundation. Again, this is a very expensive mitigation method. However, it typically is the most, the greatest security in terms of reducing your flood risk is get out of the floodplain. All right, so the next letter that we're going to go over is elevation E. This is to raise the building to or above the flood elevation level adopted by the community, but the building is still remaining on the lot it originally was in. Depending on the specific situation, sometimes it's only the utilities or a portion of the structure that needs to be elevated to bring it into compliance. Typically, the process of elevating is to separate the structure from the foundations, raise it up on hydraulic jacks, and then put in slats to or temporary supports while a new or extended foundation is built below. It's a good method for structures originally built on basements, enclosures, or open foundations. If a structure is determined to be substantially improved or substantially damaged, it may need to be elevated to be fully compliant. So this is something that could result as a requirement for substantial damage. Alrighty, so the last letter that we're going to go over for Fred is demolition. So that's another option to reduce your flood risk. It is definitely the most extreme because depending on the specific situation, especially if a structure is severely substantially damaged or severely and repetitively substantially damaged, This may be the easiest way to bring the structure into compliance is to demolish the structure. Um, and it can be a good option for any low-cost structures which are out of compliance, such as a shed or accessory structure. Then once it's demolished, if chosen by the property owner, a new compliant building can be built on the back in place, as long as it is raised and fully compliant with the community's NFIP regulations. This can involve filling in a basement, grading, and landscaping. Also available to all NFIP policyholders is something called the increased cost of compliance, which can provide, I believe it's $30,000 for mitigation measures to bring structures into compliance. So this is only available to structures which have been substantially damaged and there is a hardship and the homeowner would not otherwise be able to bring the structure into compliance. The increased cost of compliance is some money available through FEMA for the substantially damaged structures. But so this is still an option on top of any insurance claim that they may receive for substantial damage. All right, so some retrofitting resources are, FEMA has an engineered principles and practices for retrofitting flood-prone residential structures. There's also the homeowner's guide and the coastal construction manual. Each of these are for different audiences. For instance, the homeowner's guide is for homeowners. Coastal construction is for if you're trying to build in the coastal area. The engineering principles and practices is more used for your engineers as they're actually coming up with design plans. All right, so some other tools that communities have to for compliance is, well, first off, the biggest tool you have is to know your ordinance. These are your community's floodplain regulations. And while you don't need to know every property off the top of your head, you need to make sure that you know how to make a determination of if that property is in the floodplain, especially if it's in it's near, but you're unsure if it will be in the floodplain. Make sure that you have procedures written down to be able to verify whether or not there will be any floodplain interaction with the structure. Also remember that FEMA is the only entity that can change the floodplain maps. I'm sure we've all heard, like even myself, I get these calls almost on a weekly basis saying, I lived in my house for 40 years. It's never flooded. The river's never come up near my house. But that doesn't mean that they're exempt from your local floodplain regulations. Only an official letter of map change in the form of a LOMA from FEMA can remove the property from floodplain regulations. That doesn't mean that you cannot build in the floodplain. You are allowed to build in the floodplain. That's why communities have regulations for how high can you have a basement. So this does not mean that you cannot build in the floodplain, but if someone is trying to get themselves removed, only FEMA is able to do that. Finally, it is okay to get more information before providing an answer and or permit to a property owner. It's okay to reach out to me, FEMA. I would recommend probably if you have a FEMA contact that you work with, they would be a good resource. Otherwise, I would recommend reaching out to me, and then I can point you to the right people in FEMA to talk to, because FEMA is a very large agency. They do a lot of things, and so you want to make sure that you are talking to the people who are aware of the situations that you would want to be discussing. There are also, as I've kind of said, a lot of FEMA publications and resources for making substantial damage and substantial improvement determinations. And yeah, so I believe on our website, we should have a fairly comprehensive resource page with all of the technical bulletins and different guidance documents that the state of New Hampshire has put out. All right, so there's some other tools at your disposal to use. So there is other documentation a community can require to help ensure structures are built and remain in compliance. The first is the community can consider adopting and requiring a non-conservation declaration for structures with enclosures below the lowest floor. This form could be completed by the property owner and kept on file for that property. If a community wanted to adopt this, I would recommend working this into some type of procedure that is followed, and then just being consistent with all property owners in the special flood hazard area moving forward. And that is key. You do want to be consistent from property or from like permit to permit, and make sure that you are scrutinizing every project equally. All right, so another document is what's called a no-rise certification. This is so development, both building and non-building, is only permitted in the regulatory floodway, and there is no or where there is no official or no rise of the base flood elevation. That does typically require a hydraulic and hydrologic study to prove, but this certificate can be another tool used to ensure that the community is meeting its floodplain regulations. Again, as before, I would recommend that the community chooses, if a community chooses to adopt this form, have written procedures out in some internal database, just so that and also the starting date of when you are using that as standard policy, and be consistent moving forward on when you require these certifications. Another document that can be used is a flood opening certificate. This is to be used in situations where it is not feasible or desirable to meet the minimum opening criteria as detailed in a community's floodplain ordinance. This document, like ones before, must be signed and certified by a licensed professional. And all of these documents are, since they are signed by a licensed engineer or surveyor, ultimately, like these are the documents that your community has in your back pocket in case any issues arise with any of these structures. For some reason, anything goes to court. These are your defense documents to ensure that you permitted and the community did all of their due diligence in permitting this. All right, so the last document that I want to go over is a V-Zone certificate. And it's a certificate that can be used to ensure that all new or substantially improved buildings in V-zones are designed and the methods of construction to be used are in accordance with accepted standards of practice for meeting the provisions in a community's floodplain ordinance. And right here is just a screenshot of that certificate. Again, if this is something that we have a sample declaration available on our website, but if this is something that you would like help in setting up for your community, please feel free to reach out to us, and we would be happy to help you with that. All right, so inspections are another tool that communities have to ensure compliance. It's often a way to catch compliance concerns earlier or early on than once the building is completed. Typically, the best practice is to conduct a first inspection with plans in hand. You should determine that the site is as identified on the proposed plans is consistent with the actual ground conditions. Then a second inspection would need to ensure that the lowest floor will be built at the height stipulated in the permit application, and that the foundation is the type specified in the plans. Once the foundation is poured or laid, it can be very expensive for the property owner to change the building location or the elevation of the lowest floor. And then finally, the third inspection is done as the project is nearing completion. And it ensures that the foundation and floor elevation have not been altered. It is also where you would want to obtain an as-built elevation or floodproofing certificate. Verify that any enclosures below the lowest floors have adequate openings. Check for floodway encroachments, and then also for V zones, check if there are breakaway walls. I would also recommend to consider taking photos during the final inspection to document compliance and retain them in your community's permit records. All right, so you also want to think in the mindset of the property owner. So the goal is compliance, but for the property owner, that could be they could only see dollar signs. So you want to some tools you can use to help incentivize property owners to bring their structures into compliance is that, well, first off, it's for their own personal safety. And your house will be better protected from flooding. You're hopefully saving money by not having to rebuild or fix damages due to flooding. It's also better resale value, and your flood insurance rates will, they're based on many factors, but building into compliance will mean lower insurance rates. All right, so we're going to talk about some legal stuff now. So the legal tools that your community has are typically in the form of fines, stop work / cease and desist orders, and also just withholding a certificate of occupancy. When you are taking these sorts of legal actions, it is usually in the form of files, correspondence, and pictures. And you want to make sure that you log phone call conversations, emails, and just keep a good paper trail because ultimately, like if you are going down the legal route, there is a chance that this could go to court, and you do want to make sure that you have all of these certificates and files and communication available and logged to be used as evidence if needed. Okay, so best time to start to prepare for legal action is today. I know probably hear that a lot, like today's the best day to start anything, but really it's a good reminder to talk with your community's legal counsel and explain why it's important for the communities to stay in good standing, and ask your own legal counsel what tools they would be able to are in place if a violation is found. And again, remember, document it all. All right. So since we're talking about legal stuff right now, I am going to go over some of the specific requirements for the National Flood Insurance Program. So towns and cities that are enrolled in the NFIP are required to adopt the map or the most recent up-to-date maps through FEMA. Now, amendments to maps may be adopted by the governing body, select board, board of commissioners, town council, city council, board of aldermen, whatever your community has. And typically when FEMA provides new floodplain maps, there is an RSA 67457 in New Hampshire, which allows communities to adopt the most recent floodplain map in their zoning ordinance without needing to go through the entire amendment town hall approval process. But you are only allowed to change the map date. No, you can't make any other changes to the ordinance, such as like raising your freeboard requirements. Like any changes like that, like policy changes, would have to be done through the normal amendment process. All right, so enforcement obligations. So communities are supposed to be reviewing proposed development to assure that all necessary permits have been received. Review all permit applications to determine whether proposed building sites will be reasonably safe from flooding. Review subdivision proposals and other proposed new development proposals that will be reasonably safe from flooding. You also want to require within flood-prone areas new and replacement water supply systems to be designed to minimize or eliminate infiltration of floodwaters into the systems. And in flood-prone areas, you want to require new and replacement sanitary sewage systems to be designed to minimize and eliminate infiltration of floodwaters. You also want to require that all new construction and substantial improvements of residential structures within zones A, they used to be called A1 through 30. There are still some A1 through 30 zones in New Hampshire, but they are mostly all getting converted into Zone A or AE at this point. Sorry, I got on a little tangent there. So you want to make sure that those zones have structures within those zones have the lowest floor, including basement, elevated to or above the base flood level. You also want to require that all new construction and substantial improvements of non-residential structures within zones A1 through 30, AE, and AH have the lowest floor, including basement, elevated to or above the base flood level, or together with the attendant utility and sanitary facilities. There's also the requirement for all new construction and substantial improvements that are fully enclosed areas below the lowest floor that are usable solely for parking of vehicles, building access, or storage in an area other than the basement, and which are subject to flooding, shall be designed to automatically equalize hydrostatic flood forces on exterior walls by allowing the entry and exit of floodwaters. that is that bathtub effect, or trying to remedy that bathtub effect that Stephanie had mentioned earlier. Communities are also should require that manufactured homes that are placed in are placed or substantially improved within zones A, AH, and AE um, be elevated on permanent foundations such that the lowest floor of the manufactured home is elevated to or above the base flood elevation and be securely anchored to an adequately anchored foundation system to resist flotation, collapse, and lateral movement. All right, so you also want to require that recreational vehicles placed on sites within zones A, AH, and AE are either on the site for fewer than 180 consecutive days, or be fully licensed and ready for highway use, or meet the elevation and anchoring requirements for manufactured homes. A recreational vehicle is ready for highway use if it is on wheels or a jacking system and it's attached to the site only by a quick disconnect type utilities and security devices and has no permanently attached additions. All right, so some more development considerations. The area chosen for the regulatory floodway must be designed to carry the waters of the base flood without increasing the water surface elevation of that flood more than 1 foot at any point. So typically, communities can prohibit encroachments, including fill, new construction, substantial improvements, and other development within the adopted regulatory floodway, unless it has been demonstrated that the proposed encroachment would not result in any increase in flood levels within the community. All right, so we are a little early today, actually. So the key takeaways from today are to know your community's floodplain regulations and get familiar with the guidance resources available. Um, Also use the sample and template documentation when available, and adopt the procedures for consistency. And if possible, try to find violations earlier when they are easier to correct. That would be during construction or before construction, preferably. And then document as much as you can to keep your records organized because there you never know if um, what might brings a structure to court. Like there's always um, cases of someone's shed or whatever got uh, started floating down the river and then it like took out a bridge or something. And then they're going to be looking into, well, okay, how was that shed permitted? Was it compliant? Was it anchored or so keeping your documents and records organized is essential, and also just keeping those records because I have seen cases where a house has been fined for 30 years and then now we're finding compliance documents and you still want to make sure that you still have the building permits from 30 years ago in case that happens. All right. So I think we're going to open it up to some questions now. Since we are early on time today, we will give you some of your day back. But if you have any questions, please feel free. You should be able to raise your hand. You can also um, uh, put them in the chat. I did see someone just asked a question in chat. What about cutting trees in the floodplain? Um, I am not quite sure on that one. I think so. Development in the floodplain is not just structure. Um, it includes like filling, dredging, mining. I don't remember logging specifically being included in that list, but it does seem like it is something that would likely be considered some kind of terrain alteration. So I would, before doing tree cutting in the floodplain, I would check with your local building inspector to see if they would be considering that as development. Um, just trying to go back to the slide that we kind of listed out all of the um, types of development. But okay, no, I don't think we included that one. Um, okay, sorry, I'm just going to go through the presentation really quick here. I hope I'm not giving anyone a headache. Um, okay, so I saw another question in the chat. Is a basement used as a living space or storage in a floodplain if it is enclosed? Wait. Is a basement used as living space or storage in a floodplain if it is enclosed and houses a washer, dryer, and freezer, for example? Um, if there's utilities, and I would consider those appliances utilities, it likely would be in that situation li classified as living space. I believe storage is specifically for like wood piles and your car, like maybe a lawnmower, but washer and dryer and freezer are more with the electricity that makes me think they would be more considered as utilities. But there are options for you to like put the washer up on some cinder blocks. And so it's like it raised up from the floor about 2 feet. I have seen um, some instances of that. Um, but yeah, I'm sorry. That I think that would be a question for your local building official as to whether or not they would classify that as a basement. Um, I see another question asking, is there an allowable tolerance for the elevation between a crawl space floor and exterior basement before, or exterior grade before it's considered a basement? No, no. Anything below grade on all sides, doesn't matter how deep it is a basement. Unfortunately, FEMA doesn't really make a distinction between crawl space and basement. As long as it's below grade on all four sides, then yeah, it is going to be considered a basement, even if it is 1 or 2 feet. Okay, I'm going to wrap up if we don't have any other questions. Stephanie, did you see anything um, that
Um,
you want to add to?
um, nope, I'm not seeing any other questions. I thank everybody for attending today, and if anyone has any questions or needs more information, you can always feel free to reach out to us at any time.
All right. This presentation is going to be posted on our YouTube page afterwards. And also, if any of you are trying to get a use this as a course for your CFM renewal, please email me or Stephanie afterwards, and I can get you an attendance certificate so you can self-report to ASFPM. But with that, I hope give you guys back some of your day, and I hope you learned something.